The train hissed steam, a monster of iron and smoke at the crowded platform. Men and women pressed together, their faces etched with the hard lines of hope and fear, all of them pointed west. On a worn bench, set apart from the noise, sat a girl. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her dress was the color of dust, her shoes were scuffed clean through, and a single braid of hair had come loose, fighting against the wind. In her hand she clutched a crumpled ticket. The ink was a blur of smudges and sweat, but one word, stamped in heavy black letters, was impossible to miss. Child. No name, no destination, no family to claim her. The conductor, a man whose patience had been worn thin by the miles, bent down to inspect it. His eyes narrowed. He straightened up, his gaze sweeping the bustling crowd, and muttered that the rules were clear. No child rides alone, not on his train, not this far west. Around them, whispers started like a slow leak, then spread like fire. A few of the townsfolk turned, smirks twisting their lips. Who sends a child out into the territory alone? Like a piece of mail nobody wants. The girl's lip trembled, but she didn't make a sound. She just clutched that ticket tighter, as if it was the only thing holding her together. And that's when the sound of boots on the wooden planks cut through the murmurs. Heavy, deliberate. A tall cowboy stepped out from the line of passengers. His hat was pulled low, shading a face carved by sun and dust. His shoulders were broad under a trail-worn coat. His eyes, dark and watchful, weren't on the conductor. They were on the girl. Without a word, he walked to the bench and lowered himself beside her. The wood groaned under his weight. The crowd went quiet, stunned by the boldness of it. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He just sat close enough that she had to look up, her wide, frightened eyes meeting his. He looked at the ticket in her fist, then at the conductor. And he spoke in a low, steady voice that carried down the entire platform. "She rides with me." The conductor blinked, his authority challenged in front of 100 staring eyes. He jabbed a thick finger at the ticket. "It says child, sir, not daughter. That seat requires a name, a guardian." The cowboy's jaw tightened. With a slow, deliberate calm, he reached up, took off his own hat, the felt brim worn smooth from years of hard weather, and placed it gently on the little girl's head. The crown swallowed her small brow, the brim dipping so low it covered her eyes completely. A few gasps rose from the crowd. It was a gesture of claiming, of protection, so stark and simple it left no room for argument. "Then write mine," the cowboy said, and his voice was like a rifle shot in the morning air. The conductor shifted on his feet, suddenly uncertain. The girl, hidden beneath the hat, stared up at the man who had just thrown a shield over her life, with nothing more than a word and a piece of felt. The train hissed again, impatient. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, sharper. Mockery, disbelief. But the cowboy ignored them all. He just rested his arm along the back of the bench, a silent wall between her and the world. But that wall wasn't enough. The whispers turned to open laughter, cruel and sharp. A man with a crooked hat sneered that the cowboy must be desperate for a family if he was willing to claim a stray. A woman in a starched bonnet sniffed that the girl looked more like a beggar than a daughter, her dress little more than rags. The girl shrank under their words, pulling the brim of the hat down even further, trying to disappear. But the cowboy didn't move. He didn't flinch. Instead, he rose to his full height. The morning sun hit his back, throwing a long, imposing shadow across the planks, right over the jeering faces. His voice came low, but each word was a hammer blow. "A word on paper doesn't tell you her story." He gently took the crumpled ticket from her fist and held it up for all to see. "This here says child. Looks to me like she needs a father, and I reckon I'm fit enough to try." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. This was no longer just a kind gesture. It was a declaration. The conductor cleared his throat, clutching his clipboard like armor. He muttered again about the rules, but the weight of so many eyes, both mocking and watchful, made him falter. The girl peeked out from under the hat, her small hands grabbing the cowboy's sleeve. Her silence was a plea louder than any shout. The cowboy placed the ticket back in her palm, closing her small fingers around it, sealing a pact. Then he turned his gaze back to the crowd. "You call her a stray," he said, his voice hard as stone. "But a stray becomes family the moment someone stands up and says so." The laughter died. An uneasy silence crackled in its place. The conductor finally broke. He scribbled something on his ledger, grunted, and waved them toward the train. He wanted no more of this confrontation. The cowboy put a steady hand on the girl's back and guided her forward. They climbed the steps into the car, and as they did, she clutched both the ticket and the brim of his hat, as if terrified to lose either one. In her eyes, a fragile spark ignited. It was the first glimmer of belonging she had ever known. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the back of the ticket, almost invisible, was a small, strange symbol, a coiled snake eating its own tail. He'd seen it before, a long time ago, and it didn't mean family. It meant property. The train lurched, the scream of iron on iron cutting through the air. The platform, with its jeering faces, slid away. Inside the car, the cowboy, Sam he'd called himself when he signed the ledger, settled the girl into a wooden seat beside him. The oversized hat kept slipping over her eyes. Passengers across the aisle whispered, their eyes darting toward them. Sam ignored them. He stared out the window at the blurred landscape, his jaw tight. The symbol on the ticket burned in his mind. The coiled snake. The mark of a man named Silas Blackwood, a man who dealt not in cattle or land, but in people. A man Sam had once worked for, a man he had run from. The girl, still silent, sat stiffly beside him, her knuckles white as she gripped her dress. When the conductor came by again, she didn't just hand Sam the ticket. She pressed it into his palm with a desperate urgency, as if the paper itself was cursed. She was letting him carry her worth and her danger. He looked down at her, saw her lips trembling. "What's your name, little one?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Her answer was a broken whisper. "Marielle." She told him her mother had died in the winter. Her father had left long before. Her uncle, tired of an extra mouth to feed, had sold her passage west. He'd promised her a new life, but the promise felt hollow, thin as the ticket she held. Sam didn't tell her that he knew her uncle had lied. He didn't tell her she hadn't been sent to a family. She had been sold. He just repeated her name, Marielle, letting it settle between them. It felt heavy, real. She searched his face for pity, for mockery, and found none. Only a steady darkness in his eyes that seemed to understand loss. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a piece of jerky and some bread. He set them in her lap. She tore into the food with a desperate hunger that twisted his gut. When she was done, he wiped the crumbs from her chin with his bandana, a gesture so gentle it surprised them both. "That paper might say, 'Child,'" he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But from now on, you've got a father." Her eyes widened, and then, slowly, her small hand slipped into his. It was a fragile truce, a bond formed in the shadow of a threat he couldn't yet name for her. The train thundered west, but Sam knew they weren't heading toward a new beginning. They were riding deeper into the jaws of the snake, because Silas Blackwood never let his property go. Never. The hours stretched on, the landscape outside turning into a monotonous blur of brown and gray. Passengers dozed, their heads lolling with the rhythm of the train. But Sam couldn't rest. He watched Marielle sleep, her small chest rising and falling beneath his coat, the oversized hat still perched on her head. He felt a fierce, terrifying protectiveness rise in him. It was a feeling he thought he had buried long ago. He remembered the last time he'd seen that coiled snake symbol. It was branded on a crate in a dusty barn, a crate that wasn't supposed to be opened. He had been young then, working for Blackwood, taking orders without asking questions. But he had heard a noise from inside, a child's cry. His boss, a man with eyes like chips of ice, had told him to ignore it. Cargo is cargo, Sam. Best you remember that. Sam had walked away that day. He'd ridden north and never looked back. But the sound of that cry had followed him for 10 years. Now here it was again. Not a sound, but a small, warm body sleeping beside him. He had not just claimed a stray. He had stumbled into the one fight he had spent a decade running from. The train slowed as it approached a station, the whistle screaming into the dusk. Sam tensed. This was Blackwood's territory. Every lawman, every station master was in his pocket. The conductor walked through the car, his face grim. He stopped at their seat. "Next stop. Everyone out for inspection," he announced, but his eyes were locked on Sam. "Sheriff wants a word with all new arrivals." It wasn't a request, it was a warning. Marielle stirred, awakened by the change in motion. She looked up at Sam, her eyes full of sleepy confusion. "Are we there?" she whispered. Sam shook his head. "Not yet," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Just a short stop." But he knew it wasn't a short stop. It was a net closing around them. The conductor lingered for a moment. "That ticket," he said in a low voice, leaning closer. "The symbol on the back. You'd be smart to get rid of it. And the girl." Then he moved on, leaving the words hanging in the air like poison. Marielle hadn't heard. She just snuggled closer to Sam, trusting him completely. And the weight of that trust was heavier than any law, any fear. The train screeched to a halt. Outside the window, Sam could see the flickering lanterns of the platform. And waiting there, standing a head taller than the rest of the crowd, was a man with a silver star on his chest and the cold, empty eyes of a predator. It was Sheriff Brody, Blackwood's right hand. Sam's hand went to the worn leather grip of his pistol, hidden beneath his coat. He hadn't just walked into a trap. He had brought the one thing Silas Blackwood wanted most right to his front door. "Stay close to me," Sam whispered to Marielle, his voice tight. He pulled the hat's brim down a little further, hiding her face as they shuffled with the other passengers toward the door. On the platform, Sheriff Brody watched everyone who stepped off the train, his gaze sweeping over them like a hawk searching for prey. Sam kept his head down, one hand resting on Marielle's shoulder, the other hovering near his gun. He tried to blend in, to look like just another tired traveler. But it was no use. Brody's eyes snapped onto him, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He knew. "Well, well," Brody's voice boomed across the platform, stopping everyone in their tracks. "Look what the train dragged in. Samuel Rohr. I thought you'd run out of country to hide in by now." Sam froze. He felt Marielle tremble under his hand. He didn't answer. He just stared back at the sheriff, his own face an unreadable mask. "And what's this?" Brody continued, taking a slow step toward them. He gestured at Marielle. "Decided to pick up a stray? Blackwood is going to be mighty interested to hear you're back in town, Sam, especially with his property." The other passengers backed away, creating a wide circle around them. They could smell the danger. This wasn't a simple welcome. It was a reckoning. "She's not property," Sam said, his voice dangerously low. "She's my daughter." Brody let out a harsh laugh. "Daughter? You? That's a good one. Silas has been looking for this little one. Her uncle made a deal, a binding contract." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "And this document says she belongs to him. Now you can hand her over nice and easy, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." Marielle clutched his leg, her small body shaking with silent sobs. Sam looked from her terrified face to Brody's smug one. He thought about the man he used to be, the man who walked away. He wouldn't walk away this time. "There's a third choice," Sam said, his hand closing around the butt of his pistol. "You walk away and forget you ever saw us." Brody's smile vanished. His own hand drifted toward his holster. The platform was dead silent. The only sound was the hissing of steam from the engine. "You always were a fool, Sam," Brody snarled, "thinking you could defy him." Suddenly, a voice cut through the tension. An old woman, one of the passengers from their car, stepped forward. She was frail, leaning on a cane, but her eyes were sharp and fierce. "Leave them be, Sheriff," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I saw the whole thing. He claimed the child when no one else would." "That's a law older than any piece of paper you've got." Brody turned on her, his face contorted with rage. "Stay out of this, old woman." But she didn't flinch. "Or what? You'll arrest a grandmother for speaking the truth?" She looked around at the other passengers. "Are you all just going to stand here and let him take this child?" A murmur went through the crowd. Eyes shifted. They had seen Sam's quiet kindness on the train. They had seen Brody's bullying cruelty on the platform. The tide of public opinion, a fragile and fickle thing, was starting to turn. Brody hesitated, his eyes darting from the crowd to Sam. He hadn't counted on a public spectacle. He had wanted a quiet, brutal transaction. And in that moment of hesitation, Sam saw his chance. It wasn't a chance to win. It was a chance to run. Sam didn't wait for Brody to make his move. He scooped Marielle up into his arms, turned, and ran. He didn't head for the street. He vaulted over a stack of cargo crates and sprinted down the tracks, away from the station lights and into the deepening darkness. A shot rang out behind them, the crack echoing through the night. A bullet whizzed past his ear. Marielle screamed, burying her face in his shoulder. "It's all right," he grunted, pumping his legs harder, the gravel of the railbed crunching under his boots. "I've got you." He plunged into the thick brush that lined the tracks, thorns and branches tearing at his coat. He could hear Brody yelling orders, the sounds of pursuit growing behind them. They were in Blackwood's territory now, a spiderweb of paid-off lawmen and ruthless trackers. Every road would be watched, every town an ambush. The wilderness was their only hope. For what felt like hours, he ran, Marielle a light but precious weight in his arms. He followed the faint outline of a creek bed, the sound of the water masking their footsteps. His lungs burned and his legs ached, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Finally, when the sounds of the posse had faded behind them, he stumbled into a small, hidden clearing and collapsed against a rock, gasping for breath. Marielle was still trembling, her small body racked with silent fear. He set her down gently, pulling his coat tighter around her. "We're safe for now," he whispered, though he knew it was a lie. They would never be safe as long as Silas Blackwood was breathing. In the pale moonlight, he saw something clutched in her hand. It was the ticket stub, crumpled and torn, but she had held onto it through the entire ordeal. She held it out to him. He said, "I belong to him," she whispered, her voice cracking. Sam took the tattered piece of paper. He looked at the stamped word, child, and the coiled snake symbol. He thought of the life she was supposed to have, a life of servitude, of being less than human. A cold, hard rage settled in his chest. "No one belongs to anyone else, Marielle," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He tore the ticket into tiny pieces and let the wind carry them away into the darkness. "You belong to yourself, and I'm just here to make sure everyone else understands that." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. For the first time, she wasn't just a child he was protecting. She was a partner in this fight. A tiny, brave soul who had already survived more than most adults. He knew they couldn't stay put. Brody's men would be scouring the countryside by dawn. They needed to get further away, to find a place so remote that even Blackwood's reach couldn't extend. There was one place, a cabin deep in the mountains, a place his own father had built, a place he hadn't been to in over 15 years. It was a long shot, a dangerous journey on foot, but it was their only shot. "We have to keep moving," he said, getting to his feet. He offered her his hand. She took it without hesitation. Her small fingers wrapped around his, a perfect fit. Together they stepped out of the clearing and into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. A lone cowboy and a lost girl, with an entire territory hunting them. But they weren't alone. They had each other. And for now, that was enough. As they walked, the moon broke through the clouds, and Sam saw something glinting on a thin chain around Marielle's neck, tucked inside her dress. He hadn't noticed it before. "What's that?" he asked gently. She pulled it out. It was a small, tarnished silver locket. It looked old, the clasp worn smooth. "My mother gave it to me," she whispered. "She told me never to open it. Not unless I was truly lost." Sam looked at her, then at the dark, winding path ahead. They were as lost as two people could be. "Maybe," he said softly, "it's time to open it." Marielle's small fingers fumbled with the clasp. It was stiff, sealed by time and dirt. Sam used the tip of his knife to carefully pry it open. The locket sprang apart, revealing not one, but two tiny, faded portraits. On one side was a woman with Marielle's wide, serious eyes and a gentle smile. Her mother. But it was the other side that made Sam's breath catch in his throat. It was a man, younger, his face not yet hardened by cruelty. But there was no mistaking him. It was Silas Blackwood. Marielle stared at the picture, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Who is that?" she whispered. Sam couldn't bring himself to say the words. The truth was a poison he didn't want to give her. The woman, her mother, hadn't been some stranger Blackwood had bought a child from. She must have been his wife, or something close to it. And Marielle was his daughter. This wasn't about a broken contract. This wasn't about property. This was about blood. Silas Blackwood wasn't hunting a runaway servant. He was hunting his own child. Suddenly, everything made a terrifying kind of sense. The special ticket, the relentless pursuit. A man like Blackwood wouldn't tolerate a piece of his legacy running free, a living reminder of a past he wanted to control or erase. But there was something else inside the locket. Tucked behind Blackwood's portrait was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of paper. Sam carefully extracted it with the point of his knife and unfolded it. It was a map drawn in faint ink. It showed a series of rivers and mountain ranges he didn't recognize. And in the corner, a name was written, Red Feather Point, and beneath it, a short message. "He will not find you here. Find Elias. He will know." Sam stared at the name. Elias Red Feather. He'd heard whispers of the man, a native scout, a recluse who lived deep in the high country, a man who knew the mountains better than any mapmaker, a man who, according to legend, hated Silas Blackwood with a bitter passion. This wasn't just a locket. It was an escape plan. Marielle's mother had known, even back then, what kind of monster Blackwood was. She had created a lifeline for her daughter, a secret path to a safe harbor. "Who is Elias?" Marielle asked, her voice small. "I think," Sam said, a flicker of hope igniting in his chest, "he might be a friend." Their destination had changed. It was no longer just his father's old cabin. It was Red Feather Point. The journey was more dangerous, deeper into the uncharted wilderness. But for the first time since he'd sat down on that bench, Sam felt they weren't just running from something. They were running to something. He looked down at the tiny map, then back at the trail ahead. The hunt was still on. Brody and his men were out there, somewhere in the darkness. But now Sam had a compass. He had a destination, and he had a secret that could change everything. Silas Blackwood wanted his daughter back, but he had no idea that Sam now knew why. And that knowledge was a weapon. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and fear. They traveled by night, hiding in caves and thickets during the day, surviving on what little jerkies Sam had left and the wild berries he could find. Every snap of a twig, every distant bird call, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He taught Marielle how to walk silently, how to read the signs of the trail, how to be invisible. She learned quickly, her small face set with a grim determination that broke his heart. She was a child, but the wilderness was forcing her to become a survivor. One afternoon, huddled under a rocky overhang as rain lashed down, she asked him the question he had been dreading. "That man in the locket," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Is he my father?" Sam looked at her, at the raw hope and terror warring in her eyes. He couldn't lie to her. Not anymore. He nodded slowly. "I believe he is, Marielle." Her face crumpled. It wasn't the reaction he expected. There were no tears, just a quiet, devastating finality. "My mother told me my father was a monster," she whispered. "She said he collected beautiful things and locked them away in the dark. She said she was one of them, and she didn't want me to be." The words chilled Sam to the bone. This was a man who didn't love his daughter. He saw her as a possession, an object to be owned. "Your mother was a very brave woman," Sam said, his voice thick. "She gave you a way out. She gave you that map." He pulled out the locket and the tiny creased paper. "And we're going to use it." The map was their Bible. Sam studied it constantly, memorizing every line, every landmark. It led them away from the common trails, up into the rugged high country, where the air grew thin and the trees grew sparse. It was a brutal climb, testing the limits of his strength and her endurance. One night, as they huddled by a small, smokeless fire, they heard it. The baying of hounds, distant but unmistakable. Brody hadn't given up. He had brought trackers with dogs. Panic seized Sam. On foot, they couldn't outrun the dogs for long. They were exposed, exhausted. He looked around desperately, his eyes scanning the rocky terrain. And then he saw it, a narrow crevice in the cliff face, almost completely hidden by overgrown brush. It was a long shot, but it was their only one. "In here," he said, pulling Marielle toward the opening. "Quickly." They squeezed into the tight space, pressing themselves back into the cold, damp darkness. Sam pulled the brush back into place, covering the entrance. They held their breath, listening as the barking grew louder, closer. The sounds of men on horseback followed. They were right outside. Sam could hear Brody's voice, cursing the dogs, the terrain, the darkness. "He's got to be around here somewhere," Brody snarled. "Spread out. Check every cave, every crack." A lantern's light played across their hiding spot, the beam cutting through the gaps in the brush. Sam put a hand over Marielle's mouth, her heart hammering against his palm. A dog whined and scratched just feet from their hiding place. It had their scent. This was it. They were found. Then another voice cut through the night, sharp and annoyed. "There's nothing here, Brody. The scent's gone cold. The storm probably washed it away. We're wasting our time." There was a long pause. Sam could feel Brody's frustration radiating through the rock. Finally, with a string of curses, the sheriff called his men back. "All right," he growled. "We'll pick up the trail at dawn. He can't run forever." The sounds of the posse faded into the distance. Sam waited, his body rigid, for what felt like an eternity before he dared to move. When he finally pushed the brush aside, the clearing was empty. They were gone. For now. He and Marielle scrambled out of the crevice, both of them trembling. They had been closer to capture than he ever wanted to be again. But the close call had given him an idea, a dangerous, desperate idea. Brody thought he was hunting a desperate man running blindly. He didn't know Sam had a destination, and he didn't know Sam was no longer just a drifter. He was a man with something to protect. "They think we're just running," Sam whispered to Marielle as he stamped out the last embers of their fire. "It's time we started hunting back." They couldn't afford to be the prey any longer. Sam knew Brody's tactics. He knew the man was arrogant, overconfident, and that was a weakness he could exploit. The map had led them to a region of steep canyons and treacherous ridges. It was a defender's paradise. "We're going to lay a false trail," Sam explained to Marielle as they ate a meager breakfast of dried roots. "We'll lead them into the narrow pass up ahead. Then we'll double back." It was a classic guerrilla tactic, something he'd learned in his younger, wilder days. For 2 days they worked, creating a clear, obvious path. They scuffed their boots, broke branches, and even left a small, dropped piece of jerky for the dogs to find. It felt wrong, like leading their hunters right to them, but Sam knew it was their only chance. They reached the pass, a narrow slit between two towering walls of rock, and set the final piece of the trap. Sam used his rope to climb halfway up the canyon wall, finding a small hidden ledge that overlooked the trail below. He hauled Marielle up after him. From their perch, they were invisible. All they could do now was wait. The wait was agonizing. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to be a man with a rifle. Marielle huddled close to him, her eyes wide with fear, but she never complained. She trusted him. Finally, late in the afternoon, they heard the dogs. Then the posse appeared, riding single file into the narrow canyon. Brody was in the lead, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. He thought he had them cornered. Sam counted 6 men, including Brody. More than he'd hoped, but manageable. He waited until they were all deep inside the pass, the rock walls echoing the clatter of their horses' hooves. Now, Sam took a deep breath. He didn't have enough bullets to fight them all head on. But he didn't need to. He stood up on the ledge and yelled, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls. "Looking for me, Brody?" The posse pulled up short, their heads snapping up in confusion. They couldn't see him. "Show yourself, Roar!" Brody bellowed, his hand on his gun. "It's over." "Not for me," Sam called back. And with a powerful shove, he pushed a large, precariously balanced boulder he had positioned at the edge of the ledge. It crashed down onto the trail behind the posse, sending dust and rock fragments flying. The horses screamed and reared in terror. The exit was blocked. Before they could recover, Sam shoved another, smaller rockslide down, this one in front of them. It wasn't enough to block the path completely, but it was enough to spook the horses into a frenzy. Chaos erupted. Horses bucked, men yelled. One of Brody's men was thrown, his leg twisting at an unnatural angle. The dogs, caught in the panic, barked and snarled, adding to the confusion. Sam didn't wait to see the rest. He and Marielle scrambled down the other side of the ridge, away from the trapped posse. He had bought them time. Hours, maybe even a day. But it had cost him. He had revealed his position, and he had turned the hunt into a war. As they ran, the sun setting behind the mountains, Marielle looked back at him, her eyes shining with something he hadn't seen before. Awe. "You saved us," she breathed. "We saved each other," he corrected her. He knew this was far from over. Brody was a vindictive man. He had been humiliated. Now it wasn't just business for him. It was personal. They found shelter for the night in a shallow cave, the mouth hidden by a waterfall. The sound of the water was a comforting roar, drowning out the noises of the forest. Sam knew they were close to Red Feather Point. The landscape was starting to match the final section of the map. But he also knew that their pursuers, though delayed, would be relentless. As he tended to a long gash on his arm from the rock slide, Marielle did something that surprised him. She took a strip of cloth from the hem of her worn dress, tore it, and gently wrapped it around his wound. Her touch was hesitant, but sure. In that small, silent gesture, the dynamic between them shifted again. He was no longer just her protector. They were a team, a family, forged in the crucible of fear and flight. "We'll make it, won't we?" she asked, her voice small against the roar of the water. "Yes," he said, and the word was a promise to her and to himself. "We will." But as he stared out into the darkness, he saw the flicker of distant campfires, far more than there should have been for just Brody's posse. The trap in the canyon hadn't just delayed them. It had made them call for reinforcements. Blackwood was sending more men. The entire territory was closing in on them. His small victory had just raised the stakes to an impossible new level. The campfires were a clear message. The game had changed. This was no longer a posse. It was an army. Sam knew they couldn't outrun them, and they couldn't fight them. Their only hope was to disappear, to reach Elias Red Feather before Blackwood's men could seal off the mountains completely. Following the map, they moved through the most brutal terrain yet. They waded through ice-cold mountain streams to hide their scent and scrambled up rock faces that left their hands bloody and raw. Marielle never faltered. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was overlaid with a layer of hardened steel. She moved with a quiet efficiency that amazed him. The wilderness was stripping away her childhood, but it was also revealing a core of incredible strength. One evening, as they crested a high ridge, Sam saw it. A single sharp peak that stabbed at the sky, shaped like the head of an arrow. Red Feather Point. It was still a day's journey away, but seeing it, real and solid against the setting sun, was like a draught of cool water after days of thirst. But their hope was short-lived. From their vantage point, they could see the valley below, and crawling through it were lines of men, moving in a coordinated sweep. They were being herded. Blackwood wasn't just hunting them, he was driving them toward a trap. "They're pushing us east," Sam muttered, his mind racing. He looked at the map again. There was a river to the east, a wild, impassable torrent. If they got pushed against it, they would be cornered, with nowhere left to run. "They know where we're going," Marielle whispered, her voice tight with fear. Sam nodded grimly. "Or they know this is the only way out." Blackwood didn't need to know about Elias Red Feather. He just needed to know the mountains. And he had the men and the resources to choke off every possible escape route. Their only option was to do the unexpected, to go not around the hunters, but through them. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they began their descent. They moved like ghosts, slipping between the patrols, using the darkness and the terrain as their allies. At one point, they had to freeze, pressing themselves into the shadow of a boulder as two of Blackwood's men passed so close Sam could smell the whiskey on their breath. He held Marielle tight, his hand clamped over her mouth, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against his ribs. The men moved on, oblivious. The near miss left them both trembling, but they pushed forward. By dawn, they had made it through the main line of the hunters. They were in the clear for now, but they were exhausted, their nerves frayed to the breaking point. They found a small, hidden grove of aspens to rest. As Marielle finally drifted into a fitful sleep, Sam stood watch. He felt a profound and aching love for this small, brave girl. He had started this journey as a man running from his past, but now all he cared about was her future, and he would burn the whole world down to make sure she had one. It was then that he noticed the locket, still hanging around her neck. He picked it up gently, its silver surface cool against his calloused fingers. He opened it again, looking at the two faces inside, her mother, whose bravery had given them this one last chance, and her father, the monster who was trying to take it away. On an impulse, he used his knife to pry out the tiny portrait of Silas Blackwood. It felt like a small act of rebellion, of severing a tie that should never have existed. But as the picture came loose, he saw that it wasn't just paper. It was thicker, two pieces glued together. He carefully separated them. On the back of Blackwood's portrait was another, even more secret message, written in the same faint ink as the map. The serpent's head is not in the west. It is in the east. The deed is the key. Sam stared at the cryptic words. The serpent's head. Blackwood. But he was in the west. His entire empire was here. What did it mean? And the deed is the key. It made no sense, but her mother had hidden it for a reason. It was a clue, a weapon they didn't know how to use yet. Suddenly, a twig snapped behind him. Sam spun around, his gun in his hand in an instant. Standing at the edge of the grove was a man. He was tall and lean, his face a road map of wrinkles, his long gray hair tied back with a leather cord. He held no weapon. His dark eyes were fixed on Sam, not with malice, but with a deep, weary sadness. "You are a hard man to find, Samuel Rohr," the stranger said, his voice quiet but resonant. "And you have brought the devil to my mountains." Sam kept his gun trained on him. "Who are you?" "My name is Elias," the man said, "and I have been waiting for this child for a very long time." Sam slowly lowered his pistol, but his body remained tense, coiled. Elias Redfeather looked nothing like the legends. He was just an old man, weathered by the mountains and by sorrow. His eyes, however, held a wisdom that was ancient and unnerving. He looked past Sam, his gaze settling on the sleeping form of Marielle. "Her mother, Mourning Dove, came to me many years ago," Elias said, his voice a low murmur. "She knew the darkness in Silas Blackwood's heart before anyone else. She knew he would never let his property go, especially not his own blood. He had known all along. He had helped her create the plan, the map, the locket. He was the safe harbor at the end of their desperate journey." "We have to go," Sam said, his voice urgent. "His men are everywhere." Elias shook his head. "Running is over. The time for fighting is here. Blackwood has choked off every path out of these mountains. There is no escape, only victory or death." The old man's words were grim, but they rang with the terrible truth. They had been running for days, and all it had done was lead them into a smaller and smaller cage. Elias led them from the grove, following a path that was invisible to Sam's eyes. They moved through the wilderness with a newfound purpose. He took them to his home, a small, perfectly hidden cabin built into the side of the mountain, its turf roof making it nearly invisible from above. Inside it was sparse but clean. A fire was burning in the hearth, and the smell of herbs and wood smoke filled the air. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Marielle looked like she could finally breathe. While she slept, tucked under a thick fur blanket, Elias and Sam talked. "Blackwood's power is not in his guns or his men," Elias explained, his voice low and intense. "It is in the paper he holds, the deeds to this land, the contracts for his workers, the law he bought and paid for. He is a serpent made of ink and lies." He looked at Sam, his eyes sharp. "Her mother told me she had found his one weakness, his secret. She hid the proof, but she never told me where." Sam's mind raced back to the message in the locket. "The deed is the key." He pulled out the tiny scrap of paper. Elias read the words, and a slow understanding dawned on his face. "The original deed," he breathed. "The one that started it all." He explained that Blackwood hadn't built his empire. He had stolen it. Years ago, this land belonged to Elias's people. Blackwood had arrived with a government-stamped deed, claiming ownership. He had driven them out with force and brutality. But the story was that Blackwood's deed was a forgery, that the original, true document had been lost. If that original deed still exists, Elias said, his voice trembling with a long-suppressed rage, it would prove that his entire claim to this territory is a fraud. It would unravel everything he has built. It would destroy him. And Morning Dove found it, Sam finished, the pieces clicking into place. And she hid it. The serpent's head is not in the west. It is in the east. Sam thought about the geography of Blackwood's empire. His main ranch, his base of operations, was here, in the west. But his financial dealings, his banks and lawyers, were all back east in Denver. The serpent's real power, its head, wasn't on the frontier. It was in the city. The deed wasn't hidden in the mountains. It was hidden somewhere in his eastern offices. But that did them no good. They were trapped here. How do we get to it? Sam asked, the futility of their situation crashing down on him. Elias looked toward the sleeping girl. We don't, he said. We make him bring it to us. It was a plan born of pure desperation. It was insane. It was brilliant. They would send a message to Blackwood, a simple, terrifying message. They would tell him they had the proof of his fraud, and they would offer him a trade, the original deed for his daughter. He won't trade, Sam said immediately. He'll just come here and kill us all. He will come, Elias corrected him, because he is a man who cannot stand to have a secret held over him. He needs to possess everything, to control everything. He will not risk his entire empire on the chance that we are bluffing. He will bring the deed, intending to kill us and take back both it and the girl. It was a suicide mission. They would be luring the devil into their home, knowingly walking into a final, fatal confrontation. But as Sam looked at Marielle, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days, he knew Elias was right. It was the only way to cut the head off the snake. It was the only way to set her free, once and for all. All right, Sam said, his voice steady. Let's set the trap. Getting the message to Blackwood was the first challenge. Elias knew the terrain, and he knew the people. He had a contact, a half-breed trapper who sometimes worked for Blackwood, but whose loyalty was to the mountains, not the money. For a small price, the trapper agreed to carry the message. It was simple, written on a piece of bark. Red Feather Point, the deed for the girl. Sunrise, 3 days. Come alone. They all knew he wouldn't come alone, but the instruction was part of the psychological game. It was a challenge to his arrogance. The next 3 days were a strange mixture of calm and suffocating tension. Elias taught Marielle the names of the mountain plants, how to find water, how to listen to the language of the wind. He was giving her the tools to survive, no matter what happened. Sam, meanwhile, prepared for war. He and Elias scouted the area around the point, a flat, rocky outcrop with a sheer drop on one side. It was an exposed, dangerous place for a meeting, but it was also a perfect stage. They planned every detail, every contingency. They set small rock slides ready to be triggered. They prepared hidden firing positions. They were 2 men against an army, but they had the advantage of terrain and surprise. On the morning of the 3rd day, a thick fog blanketed the mountains, clinging to the trees and muffling all sound. It was an unexpected gift. Under the cover of the fog, Sam and Elias led Marielle to a small hidden cave, a safe distance from the meeting point. No matter what you hear, Sam told her, kneeling down to look her in the eyes, you stay here until I come for you. Do you understand? She nodded, her small face pale but resolute. She clutched his hand. You will come for me, she said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of faith. The weight of that faith settled on his shoulders, heavier than any mountain. He left her with Elias's old, rusty hunting rifle, a weapon too big for her, but a comfort nonetheless. Then he and Elias moved to their positions near the point. As the sun began to rise, its light struggled to pierce the thick fog. The world was a swirl of gray and white. It was eerily silent. Then they heard it, the crunch of a single pair of boots on the gravel. A figure emerged from the mist. It was Silas Blackwood. He was alone. Or he appeared to be. Sam's hand tightened on his rifle. This was too easy. It was a trap within a trap. Blackwood stopped in the center of the outcrop, a leather satchel in his hand. "Roar," he called out, his voice cutting through the fog. "I'm here. I have what you want. Now give me my daughter." "Show me the deed first," Sam yelled back from his hiding place among the rocks. Blackwood opened the satchel and pulled out an old, yellowed document tied with a ribbon. It looked authentic, but Sam knew better than to trust his eyes. "Where's the girl, Blackwood?" Elias's voice called out from another direction, making it seem like there were more of them. Blackwood's head snapped toward the sound. His calm demeanor was starting to crack. "The trade was for her," he snarled. "No more games." "We're not playing games," Sam said, stepping out from behind his cover, his rifle aimed squarely at Blackwood's chest. "She's not here. She's safe. You're not getting her back. Not now, not ever." Rage contorted Blackwood's features. "You fool. Did you really think I'd come alone?" He whistled a high, piercing sound, and all around the outcrop, figures began to rise from the fog. Snipers hidden in the rocks. At least a dozen of them. They had been outmaneuvered, surrounded. It was over. But as the snipers took aim, Blackwood smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression on his face. "You see, Sam," he gloated, "I always win." Then a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a roar, a sound of raw, primal fury. From the path leading up to the point, a massive grizzly bear appeared, lunging out of the fog. It charged directly at the nearest sniper. The man screamed, his rifle firing uselessly into the air before the bear was on him. Panic erupted. The snipers, their attention fixed on Sam, were completely unprepared. The bear, a whirlwind of claws and teeth, tore through their line. And behind the bear, Elias Redfeather appeared, letting out a war cry that echoed through the mountains. He had spent the last day not just setting traps of rock, but of nature. He had used bait to lure the territorial grizzly to the path, knowing the fog would hide its approach. While chaos reigned, Sam kept his rifle trained on Blackwood. The man was staring in horror, his perfect plan literally being torn to shreds. He dropped the deed and drew his pistol, but he was too slow. Sam fired. The shot hit Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around. He staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief and pain. He was standing right at the edge of the cliff. He teetered for a moment, his arms windmilling, trying to regain his balance. Then, with a final, choked cry, he fell backward into the fog-shrouded abyss. Silence fell over the point, broken only by the fading sounds of the retreating bear and the groans of the wounded men. Sam stood, his rifle smoking, his heart pounding. It was done. The serpent was dead. He found the deed lying on the ground. He picked it up. It was the real one, the key to undoing an empire of lies. He walked back to the cave where he had left Marielle. She was standing at the entrance, the oversized rifle in her hands, her eyes wide. She ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs. He knelt and held her, burying his face in her hair. The long run was over. They were finally, truly free. The sun finally broke through the fog, bathing the mountain in a brilliant golden light. A new day, a new life. Sam, Marielle, and Elias stood on the point, looking out at the vast territory spread below them. It no longer looked like a prison. It looked like a promise. "What will we do now?" Marielle asked, her voice quiet. Sam looked at the deed in his hand, then at her. He knew what he had to do. He had to take this paper to Denver, to the law, and expose Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise. He had to ensure that every contract was broken, every stolen piece of land returned. He had to finish the job Morning Dove had started. "First," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "we find a home, a real one." He scooped her up into his arms. She was no longer a stray with a ticket marked child. She was Marielle Rohr. She was his daughter. And as they began the long walk down the mountain, leaving the ghosts and the violence behind them, they were not just a cowboy and a child. They were a family, forged in fire and bound by a love stronger than any bloodline. A love that had stared into the heart of darkness and had not flinched. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tales from the forgotten corners of history. And let us know in the comments below. What do you think is stronger, the law written on paper or the law written on the human heart?